So, welcome everybody to this evening's Lancaster University Public Lecture. Now, my name is Professor Rebecca Lingwood. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the university, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you, the audience, but also particularly our speaker. Now, you're just as welcome this evening if it's your first time at a public lecture or if you're a regular here. I have to admit that I'm new to the university, and so this is my first public lecture. But so some of you will be much more experienced at this than I am. But I want to wish you all a fantastic evening. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jane Davidson, our speaker this evening. Now, Jane has got many accolades and affiliations, and I'm going to tell you just some of them. So Jane is the chair of the Wales Net Zero 2035 and the author of #FutureGen, Lessons from a Small Country. And I think we'll hear more about that later. She's Pro-Vice Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Wales, Trinity St David, Vice President of Garden Organic and patron of the UK Chartered Institute of Ecologists and Environmental Managers. Previously, Jane was Cabinet Minister for Education, then Environment and Sustainability in Wales, and now lives on a small holding in West Wales, where she aims to live lightly on the land. I like that. So in this talk, Jane will explore many things, I'm sure, but including how legislation can protect future generations, and we'll also discuss the ethics and the values behind approaches to policymaking. Jane will explain how she proposed a piece of legislation that became the first in history to put sustainability and future generations absolutely at the core of government decision-making, no small undertaking. Jane is lauded by the United Nations. This law has sparked global conversations about how governments can rethink democracy, tackle climate change, and foster long-term well-being. When Jane has finished speaking, we're going to have a panel, and you can see the chairs ready for the panel, of some academics from Lancaster University, chaired by one of our students, and I'll introduce the panel at the point that we get to that in the evening. There'll also be some questions and answers, some Q&A at the end, and the chance to ask Jane and the panel your questions. And we're delighted to have Jane with us here tonight, and really it's not for me to spend any more of your time. I just want to hand over to Jane. It's a great pleasure. Really looking forward to this first public lecture for me at Lancaster. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm afraid it's one of those moments when you hear things and you think of all the things that people have read about you. You know, actually, I'm a mum and a granny, and everything I do is for my grandchildren and any children that they might have yet to come. So, yes, I was asked to look at the impact of having legislation around future generations. And as Rebecca was saying in her introduction, I have to say I'm really disappointed that Wales is still the only country in the world that has a law to protect future generations. But as she also said, and we'll come to it a bit later, there is enormous amount of interest in other countries across the world. And I think that considering the way in which the sort of tectonic plates of politics in the world have changed, literally, in the last month, I also understand that there's even more interest in actually looking at providing a kind of robust defence for policy based on evidence. So I hope you find this of interest, and there will be the panel, as Rebecca was saying, but please also ask me questions, ask the panel questions, because I'm not coming back up here again for a while. After my very long journey yesterday and another very long journey coming up tomorrow. But I love being here in the north. This is a fantastic university and it's in a wonderful place. So I'm really, really pleased to be joining you here today. I thought I'd start with a bit of I think this is actually incredibly good news. I don't know whether we've got any actuaries in the audience, but of course actuaries look at risk. And the really important thing about looking at risk is actually then determining what kind of policies, what kind of consequences there are for carrying on in the sort of behaviour that increases risk. And literally a couple of weeks ago, this was a report from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. The global economy could face a 50% loss in GDP between 2070 and 2090 unless immediate policy action on risks posed by the climate crisis is taken. Now, I've been trying to influence the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries for about 30 years. So to read this now is absolutely extraordinary, because this will affect everything around insurance. It will affect the ability of pension funds to invest. This is going to have a massive consequence on what happens with large amounts of money. And it's worth reading the report, because as I'll talk about as I go through the slides, it talks about if we don't take the policy action now, and we still have plenty of opportunities to take policy action now. So I wanted to start with, in a sense, the backstory in the context of why we did what we did in Wales. And just for those of you who don't, sort of not nerds of devolution, like those of us who've lived through a number of changes linked to that, essentially, back in 1999, with a vote the previous year of less than 0.5% in favour, Wales moved from having a Secretary of State with a large civil service in Cardiff to having suddenly 60 politicians in Cardiff. In 1999, and I was privileged to be one of those first politicians. So there was a lot of politicians, and we had no powers, because the Secretary of State had no powers, effectively, and the powers that the Secretary of State had were transferred to the politicians. So there were a very small number of things we could do. One of them was curriculum. So I as Education Minister for my first 7 years, I really dug into that. But the story of tonight is very much linked to the fact that just before Parliament agreed the Government of Wales Act, a wicked MP put an amendment in that the new National Assembly for Wales should have a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. Now, for somebody like me, who had been an environmentalist all my life, was a teacher by profession, and then worked with youth worked in universities, worked in colleges, in fact had done most of my education portfolio as a practitioner, the idea of being in the only institution that wanted to promote sustainable development in everything that we did was really exciting. And so for the first decade, there were a lot of us who came in that sort of new, bright, shiny assembly. Because we didn't have many powers, we really got behind the ones we had. And therefore, we tried really hard. We promoted here, we promoted there, we promoted everywhere. And it wasn't until about 2010, by which time I'd been a minister for 10 years, that somebody let me know that actually the civil service had taken legal advice back in 1999 and found out the duty to promote meant nothing. Didn't have to change what they did at all. So they wrote it into all our speeches, so we promoted here and we promoted there without knowing that it meant absolutely nothing. And I found that out in the same year that I met Becky Willis, one of the people who work here in Lancaster doing amazing work on citizen democracy, which was because she was one of the Sustainable Development Commissioners, and I relied really heavily on the Sustainable Development Commission for advice in terms of what I did as a minister. And then an incoming government in Westminster wiped out the Sustainable Development Commission overnight on its 10th anniversary. And I remember going back from Bristol to Cardiff by train, thinking, how could this not have been protected by law? And so it suddenly became apparent to me that what we had to do was turn a duty to promote into a duty to deliver. And that duty to deliver became the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was passed in 2015. And I'm sorry for the kind of long introduction in a way, but these things never come. You know, I might have been kind of celebrated as the person who proposed the architecture of the Act, but if there'd never been a duty to promote, I'd never have wanted to do a duty to deliver. If there'd never been what happened to the Sustainable Development Commission, I would just have relied on the Sustainable Development Commission for good advice. But the really exciting thing was that there was a second referendum, and so the Welsh people, who had only in 1998 voted by a tiny amount, 0.5%, to support this new devolution project in Wales, in a second referendum, they voted overwhelmingly in support of new devolution in Wales. And that meant in 2011, the Welsh Government was given primary lawmaking powers in all the areas for which it has responsibility, without which this could never have happened. So these things are a journey, not an event. But essentially, the Future Generations Act, I'm sure most people in this room will know about the Sustainable Development Goals. Round the outside of that picture of Wales, in the centre, are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the 7 goals that make up the heart of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and you can see them on the screen, they were deliberately nuanced to the Sustainable Development Goals, so that Wales, not a member state in the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was the member state, therefore was doing something that could be helpful to other countries in the world in how they delivered on their Sustainable Development Goals. And also, on the face of the Act, you find these 5 ways of working. Every public organisation in Wales, including the Welsh Government, that lies within Welsh Government authority, has to demonstrate they think long-term, they think preventatively, they collaborate with each other, they integrate the outcomes in terms of the goals, and they involve people about whom decisions are being made. Now, not a perfect picture yet by any means, but a really important narrative about the way you take decisions. So this is a new constitution for Wales, a new values framework for Wales. And yet it's a values framework that over the 10 years prior to this, every time on every area where the Welsh Government and the third sector consulted Welsh people about the kind of Wales they wanted to see, these are the kinds of propositions that came forward. And all the words here on the face of the Act for each of the goals have come out of dialogue with the people of Wales. And I think one thing that's really, so the context and the content here is not a minister, but actually the people of Wales saying what kind of country they wanted to live in. So if you look at prosperity as a goal, a prosperous Wales, innovative, productive and low carbon. but also taking advantage of the wealth generating through securing decent work. In fact, the word decent has recently changed to fair work. But this very clear idea that this is something which embraces the whole population. This is not an individual political party proposition. This is about how a country can best engage with the challenges for the future. And a resilient Wales, I still wish was called that should be a nature goal for me, but it's actually about not just maintaining, but enhancing a biodiverse natural environment. A healthier Wales, not about how many doctors and nurses, but what are those elements that constitute and can contribute towards people's good health, and what are the choices and behaviours therein? You know, more equal Wales. How can everybody have the chance to fulfil their potential, no matter what their background or circumstances? And unless you have sort of visions like this, then of course what you do is you narrow down opportunities for people. You narrow down opportunities in the context of all aspects of society. If you don't give more support to schools in low socioeconomic areas, then actually you don't enable those pupils to achieve the same kind of outcomes as others. So all of this is about how you do your spend, you know, what your budget looks like, where your priorities lie. And obviously in Wales, pwysig iawn, very important to respect and endorse both the culture and the language, but also the heritage of the country. And I think this issue around culture is incredibly important because every place has a culture. And we need to respect those cultures when we engage in place-based initiatives. And the last one, for me, is absolutely critical, which is that if we're going to be globally responsible, let's think about it just in terms of offshoring our emissions. This says very clearly, can't do that, because you have to behave in what you do globally as though you were doing it in Wales. Now, for those of you working on the challenge of Scope 3 emissions, that's a really interesting kind of approach. So you can't deal with problems by taking them offshore. And of course, you do need to have people holding others to account. So you've got a combination. You've got, some of you may have heard that there's a Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, independent of government, actually appointed by government, but has to go through a parliamentary process before they are appointed by government. The Auditor General for Wales, because the auditing of government and all the public services, it has to be done in the same way. Because if you don't put this into the primary audit functions, and you just put it in a sort of secondary audit function over here, then government wouldn't do it. So government is accountable to the Future Generations Commissioner, to the Auditor General, and to the courts. Now, I'm not sure that if this is translated into other countries, this is the area that's most difficult, because many governments feel that they don't want to be accountable to a Future Generations Commissioner. But countries which feel they need help in moving in this kind of direction, and there are about 30 odd I'm working with at the moment, do feel that this sort of model means they can continue to be held to account in terms of the kind of actions that they choose. And I think what's really interesting is what you see happen as a result of this. So if we ask that question about can you change outcomes with legislation, I would say absolutely yes. I mean, I think this one, in 2003 as Education Minister, I was part of a whole narrative about, you know, wanting to ban the smacking of children. I mean, we banned the smacking of adults, so it always seemed extraordinary to me that we weren't prepared to ban the smacking of children. And we could not get it through. Because any major constitutional issue like that had to have a 2/3 majority. So although there were majorities, they weren't enough in terms of getting that through. It just sailed through in 2011 through the framing of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The roads review that happened 2 years ago about using a climate review as to whether or not a new road should be built and where it should be built, and whether or not it was going to affect any particularly SSSIs. And a very famous example of that was quoted a lot, and I think even made it into the FT at the time, the Financial Times, was when, as a result of an intervention by the first Future Generations Commissioner, which was agreed by our First Minister, what we call our Prime Minister in Wales, he refused to allow an extension to the M4, which would just have ploughed its way through an SSSI, a special site of scientific interest. So quite an extraordinary decision in some ways, a very brave decision, because the business community all wanted, more roads to bring more cars in more often. But actually, something that really signalled how the Act was changing the nature of delivery. 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, some of you might have heard of. We've been very famous for our 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. And I've just read the most extraordinary headline this week, which actually demonstrated that Wrexham Council, which wanted to put quite a few of the speed limits back to 30 miles an hour, is being challenged in the courts about whether it will now be liable if a child gets killed. Because we know that all the road organisations have demonstrated that we have actually had about 100 fewer deaths as a result of the 20-mile-an-hour limit being in place. So it's really interesting now how those people who want the right to speed are now potentially being held to account. A new Welsh statutory education curriculum that's focused on skills, that's focused on curious learner. Subjects are gone in Wales. You may not know this, but the people I talked to this morning on the Morecambe Bay curriculum now do know this. And we operate on areas of learning. And right through from the age of 3 through to 18, throughout the whole of our statutory curriculum. And then what I'm going to say a bit more about now is the Net Zero Wales 2035. So this was, I've been out of politics a long time. I left politics in 2011, and I took up a post in a university, initially leading on sustainability and subsequently becoming one of these amazing university names, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Sustainability and External Engagement. And therefore looking at how we could use the university as a vehicle to drive these sorts of agendas forward. And then I retired from there in 2019 when I was asked to write the book Future Gen by a major American and then new British publishing company that wanted to really look at what policy and law interaction could be if it was going to drive a different kind of world. So I was asked by one of the opposition parties in Wales, Plaid Cymru, before I was asked by my old party Labour whether or not I'd be prepared to lead work on could we speed up, could we accelerate the timetable to net zero in Wales. I'm sure most of you know that there is a legislative commitment to net zero in the UK through the Climate Change Act for all parts of the UK to reach net zero by 2050. And this is what I was asked to do. How adverse effects may be mitigated, costs and benefits are shared fairly, impact on society and sectors. And I agreed to do it provided we used the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is why I've been into more detail than I might have been with you, as the way of doing it. So we knew that what we wanted to achieve was to see could we accelerate so that we could have a 10-year plan in terms of delivery. Why? Because the science is telling us literally every day at the moment that action needs to be speedier than we're currently taking it. But the how is the big thing. How do you do this in a way that is not going to negatively impact, particularly on the poorest people in our society? Well, for me, I always start with some academic underpinning. And this is from Cardiff University. And we determined that we were going to look at the big 4 emission areas. How could Wales heat and build low-carbon homes by 2035? What could education, jobs and works look like across Wales by 2035? Because that was such a key answer, the opportunity answer in the context of skill. How could we have a transport system fit for purpose by 2035? How could we meet energy needs, phasing out fossil fuels? How could we feed ourselves by 2035? And what we asked the Wales Centre for Public Policy to do is look at the best evidence anywhere in the world. And what was really surprising to me when they came back to us, because this work is entirely independent but preceded what we did with it, was to find that nowhere in the world, other than through the Climate Change Committee, which was very focused on, in a sense, numerical reductions, nowhere could they find examples of pathways to delivery that actually said what you needed to do in each year in order to achieve the outcome you wanted to achieve. So this effectively is what we aim to do. We started work in January 23, we published in September 2024. We used broadly the same titles as had been used. The pictures are there because that is the Deputy First Minister in Wales, and this is the spokesperson from Plaid Cymru. So we kept both parties. Their cooperation fell apart completely. They were completely at war with each other by the time we were halfway through this work. But on this, the parties sustained cooperation, which I was really pleased to see. So what we did then was to create pathways. And you see here that you'd have an immediate term of 2025-27, a near term 27-30, and long term, in brackets, 2030 to 2035. So we wanted to lay out what needed to happen in every year, who needed to do it, whether it could come from outside Wales, whether it needed to be done by the UK government and others. We wanted to do it, we wanted to show why we covered the areas we did, which was all about opportunity, lay out the pathways, think about how that opportunity could be translated into direct policy initiatives, and then put all that pathway advice in place, including references and case studies, and then lay out at the end why we'd done what we'd done. So we were very clear about what we didn't do as well. No report like this could ever be comprehensive. But I've said to a few people today, in one of my last couple of years as minister, I asked the officials to count how many recommendations I'd been sent in that week. And it was 3,004. So sending recommendations to ministers, I expect UK ministers get many more than that. But, sending recommendations to ministers without saying how to do it is just not helpful. And yet many people in the room will be the absolute experts who ministers draw on in terms of how they're going to develop outcomes. So I'm sure we'll make these slides available to people who've booked in. But I think that there are some overarching messages, which is, yes, it will require a significant step change. Yes, it requires ambition, but there will be huge benefits. And there'll be huge benefits by doing it now. Even though if Wales was doing it on its own, it's a very small country to do this stuff. So there'll be things we can't do effectively. I mean, we can't guard against sea level rise if the rest of the world carries on behaving badly, for example, but we can engage with our populations to make sure that they're not victims of that, for example. And there's not very good work on that yet at the moment, even with the sea level rise. But it's how we do it urgently, but how we do it in a planned way, because unintended shocks are never good for anyone. And in terms of the transition, it's a bit like sometimes, I mean, in my university, we determined that if we were really serious about sustainability, we were going to put those roles in the office of the Vice-Chancellor, because that put you right at the centre of the university in terms of being able to deliver. And the group was really, really keen that similarly, in this work, that this had to be under the purview of the First Minister. Or under that, and that doesn't mean to say that it's run out of that office, it just means that the purview, so that the First Minister is fully supportive and aiming to deliver and takes responsibility for ensuring this happens. And I think that otherwise, it's quite difficult to get some of this stuff, which is longer term, in against a more short-term discussion. It is about using the legislation you have. It is about working with key partners, such as local authorities. And some of you may know that actually what we were able to do previously like when I became the first bag lady, introducing the first charge on carrier bags in the UK, within 4 years, all other parts of the UK followed. So we're a very good size for piloting. And when I introduced our recycling requirements, for which I had to beg the previous Labour government to let me do it, they only did it because they wanted to see whether it could be done as a pilot. But Wales, hopefully next year, will be best in the world. It's either second or third, depending on which metric you look at the moment. But all of these things require discussions with partners and discussions with citizens. And I think this issue about how you engage effectively with citizens, the sort of don't do it about us without us narrative, is probably the biggest single narrative that needs to be driven forward in terms of doing this stuff, as well as how you frame it in a way that challenges some of the very kind of like anti-evidence propaganda that we're reading about at the moment. So you'll see the kind of things that we propose. There isn't enough money in Wales to do this stuff. So, how do you bring more money in a way that actually gives you integrity finance, but total control over the planning system, and therefore using the tools that you have available. And in terms of restoring nature, one of the things that we found, and I got very excited in one of the conversations with staff here today, was that we talked a lot about nature-based solutions, but actually when I said, right, I want examples of effective nature-based solutions, of course there are some, but they haven't been in place long enough in many ways in terms of actually being able to utilise in terms of delivery. So it's about, for example, how we can create evidence-based delivery mechanisms. And I've asked the First Minister to consider a separate report just looking at what the nature-based solutions could look like to back up this work. I think that, I'm not going to read all of these out, but I think it's, you'll see a common thread. There's something around opportunity that's not there, a national green skilling wage. There's something about, there are superb climate action groups in one county in Wales, in Carmarthenshire, that may be really useful to anybody wanting to look at taking that forward. And then there's, why don't we, as higher education institutions, actually mandate these sorts of literacy models for all our students? Because, those of you who are here who are students, you need this stuff. You need to understand the consequences of actions, both of your university, but also actions of others in this context. We found that Wales just doesn't, we produce, for example, a tiny amount of the fruit and vegetables we need to eat in Wales. So if anything happened around food security, basically, we've got beef and lamb. And there's 10 million or more of those for 3 million people, but we would not be able to provide anything else. So, we've got, and that's, Wales is particularly out of kilter, but actually all of the UK is out of kilter in terms of what healthy diets look like. And it took us a long time, probably took us longer to get that phrase, reduce the dominance of livestock production, than anything else in the report. Energy is actually relatively easy because we know what to do on energy. And we deliberately in our report also decided we were not going to go anywhere where there were outcomes that we weren't prepared that we don't yet have. All these people thinking there'll be a technological answer down the line. Well, as somebody who put the first carbon capture and storage grant in place in 2008, there is still no evidence that it works. And so we did not put anything into carbon capture and storage. We didn't do anything about nuclear, and although personally I think there are alternatives, that wasn't why we didn't do it. We didn't do it because the timescale of building nuclear is such a long timescale, you couldn't rely on it if what you were trying to do was a 10-year pathway. But we did, and we had to really haggle with the developers in Wales, was we have dramatically increased the community benefit for renewables that can be visually seen or in any way impact on communities. And similarly with heat and build, we know what to do, but we also know that actually the sort of hostility to heat pumps, 3 times as efficient. It's really odd when you think about these things. But lots of restrictions in current planning systems. So how do we take that out in a way that's beneficial? But on this one, this is the one we found, that although we knew what to do, Wales's housing is so bad that it would be too interventionist to do this within 10 years. Because it's such radical intervention in people's lives if you're going to change things about housing. So we know what to do, but we could get it done by 2040. So it would still be well within the limits in terms of our climate change obligations. And on travel, travel is really bad in Wales. I am 30 miles 30 miles north of my nearest train station, and I'm 38 miles south of my nearest train station, depending on whether I'm travelling north or I'm travelling south. And I'm not alone in that. Most of Wales has no trains, and the buses are so infrequent because the distances are so huge and they cost the councils massive amounts of money. So we really started looking at how you could completely change travel type of opportunities. And I know a number of people here interested in transport may be interested in that work. But what it's led to is now this big issue about prioritising prevention. So when I presented this to chief finance officers of health boards a few weeks ago in London, they just wanted to bite my hand off about the idea that we prioritise prevention, because they don't feel they can. And yet it is the biggest public health benefit available. So this is definitely changing the narrative in Wales. And I'm just going to kind of leap through these because I don't want to go through them in detail. But one of the big issues about this is, do you have metrics that can actually measure what good outcomes look like? And of course, if you totally change the outcomes, you almost definitely don't have any metrics that will work. So a few of us got together to create a One Planet standard, working with a company called Assessment Services. And this works for any organisation who wants to measure its impact, and then can go through a process by which it can be awarded bronze or silver or gold. We've got local authorities doing it, piloting it at the moment. We've got health boards piloting it. We've got 2 universities piloting it. So it's all ways in which you can determine yourself what you want to do, but it has to be real. and then you can go through either an external accreditation process, or you can use it internally in terms of driving forward your continuous improvement. And I just want to sort of finish with the fact that Donella Meadows, who some of you know, Professor Donella Meadows, who's one of my absolute heroes, the systems thinker, she talked about the fact that if we behave as though the world had no limits, the result is collapse. If you behave as though the limits are real, and there's not enough time, the result is also collapse. So we need to behave as though the limits are real and close, and there is no time to waste before we act. Now, she wrote that in 1972, initially, and she assumed when she wrote Limits to Growth that governments would listen, evidence-based, and they didn't. So when she reframed it in 2002, she actually talked about it in the context of, you know, what vision do you have for the kind of world you want? What kind of network do you want to engage with? Are you prepared to tell truth to power? What will you learn on the way to this? And do you love people enough to take action? And I think that this probably more than, I mean, I've used this slide for about 6 months, but I feel this slide was kind of made for the last couple of weeks. Because we have to have a time when we shed our fear and give hope to each other, and that time is now. And Rebecca said that, the UN, at its conference, and I think this is really hopeful, at its conference in last September, the world adopted a pact for the future. I think it was Russia, North Korea. I think now it would be America. It wasn't America then. But, it was Russia, North Korea. Actually, China supported it. The idea that there should be a pact for future generations so that we consider our impact on future generations, delivering for future generations as we would have wanted past generations do unto us. And they're just about to appoint a special envoy which will be based on the Welsh model. And by 2028, they're hoping to have a set of plans that UN members across the world will be prepared to adopt on how they will sign up to deliver on this, which is also a mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I remain hopeful that there are larger forces interested in more people across the world that are forces for good. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, Jane. That was hugely thought-provoking. The fun isn't over. We now have our panel, and can I invite the panellists to take a chair? And I will introduce our panel members. So on the far end, we have Professor Becky Willis, who is a professor here at Lancaster University and a specialist in energy and climate governance. And then we have Dr. Deu Esenonu, who is lecturer in policy and politics and has a focus on creating more inclusive and participatory democracy. And we have Finn Trevartha Smith on this end, who is a third-year undergraduate student here at Lancaster, studying politics and sociology, and will be chairing our panel sessions. So I'm just really looking forward to this session. And Finn, you'll take us into some questions and answers as well at the end. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great, it's working. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the introduction. So, as you all know, we're joined by 3 panellists with a background in environment and policy today. So we're going to start with asking them some questions about their research interests, and then we will later open that up to you, the audience, to ask some of your own questions. Particularly, I think for me, I found the limits to growth idea and the shift in mindset to be particularly compelling. So I wanted to start with you, Becky. What would you say stuck out to you from that part of the lecture, and how does it align with your personal interests?
So I think what has been really brilliant about watching the last 15 years of Wales is to see what's possible when a small country, and I think size is important there actually. I think there's something about, Wales being maybe just the right size, what you can do when a small country actually challenges the orthodoxy in quite a calm way, and in the kind of way where, of course we're doing this is, obvious and sensible. And definitely, you mentioned how we worked together back in the day on the Sustainable Development Commission, and, you very much learned from our failure to continue to exist. And so I think that so, when the SDC as it was disbanded, we did see our legacy continuing in Wales. But I think a crucial shift for me, and we were discussing this earlier today, was the fact that whereas when this was set up in the UK, it was based around sustainable development, which, I continue to think is absolutely crucial, but it's quite a dry formulation. And the twist that Wales added, and you added, Jane, through the Future Generations Act, was actually to make it human-centred language, to make it about people, as you started, about your grandchildren, about what it is to live well in a small country on a fragile planet. And that is what's really powerful for me. And, whenever I hear news from Wales, it just takes me back in seeing, I was really, really struck by the slide where you showed sort of very specific legislative initiatives which relied on that overall framework. And you're just getting on with that job. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe rather than a pilot country, it's a leader. And now, same question for you, Dio. What stuck out to you in particular, and how does that align with your research interests personally?
So I'm particularly interested in the politics of policymaking, and I think what stuck out to me in terms of how you've gone around sort of doing what is radical sort of policy changes and ways people think about policy, and there were 4 kind of key things that stuck out to me. So the first was kind of the willingness and of politicians and policymakers to encourage to try something different, to be a little bit radical, and calm with it. And then I think what you were talking about in terms of the duty to promote versus the duty to deliver, I think that's a really interesting distinction from the point of view of sort of in the work that I do with racial justice, where there is a public sector equality duty.
Question mark.
Question mark, yes. And whether there is that kind of, to achieve the radical change that racial justice requires, whether we do need to shift from this kind of duty to consider, duty to promote, to this kind of duty to deliver, and how would that look like? And then really critically, because I'm interested again in sort of the dialogue, participatory, deliberative democracy, and how you talked about how the act was in dialogue with people. I think that's really sort of, that stuck out to me. And sometimes policymakers might think involving the public in these types of initiatives, they might not bring any expertise to the table. And this was just a beautiful example of kind of technical, political, and public expertise being in synergy. And then really interesting, and the final bit for me was the holding to account. There's loads of promises that could have happened, and this could have stayed on a shelf somewhere, but actually having that kind of accountability element to it, I think is really powerful. So within kind of racial justice work, there's been, I think over the last kind of few years, there's been lots of promises, right? About, this is what we're going to do, or we might issue a commission on this, or, but actually, that kind of holding to account part of it is not there, I think, and so having that within this policy, within this sort of generation, the Act, I think is really important. So those are the kind of 4 things that stood out to me.
Okay, brilliant. And speaking of promises, Jane, this is a question for you. What are our biggest obstacles to a sustainable future, and how can we overcome them? Just thought I'd start you off with an easy one.
And have I got a minute? Yeah, I probably think differently about this today than I might have literally 2 months ago. I think one of our biggest obstacles is, although I'm grateful for the comment about more human language in Wales, it's not human enough, is it, in terms of winning this debate? And so, you know, in a sense, we should have a lot on our side. You know, we've got the evidence of what is happening. That is endorsed by thousands of academics across the world. We're pretty clear about the kind of pathways that should be taken. They will save governments money in the longer term, but we still have this real short-termism in terms of elections. And we still have parties who have to demonstrate to their populations that they are going to be better off if they vote for them. So this real dislocation, I think that is one of the biggest obstacles. And I think the other obstacle is we have not found a narrative yet. I mean, I used to talk about this is common sense, but having heard Donald Trump talk about common sense in the last few weeks, I'm not going to use that phrase anymore because he means something entirely different. So there's a sort of question about how can we engage in a non-party political way, so there's no othering that goes on, because at the moment there's a lot of othering by blaming others for the situation you find yourself in, and therefore if you can be made to blame those others, you will vote for a particular party. This is not about party politics. This is a test from whether democratic systems can be brave enough. And going back to your point about small, Becky, it's, do we now need to think in much smaller places to win people to action in those places in order to ensure that the lots of the smalls become the big in terms of challenge? I think we need to have a really hard think in order to deliver the sort of outcomes that our international panel endorsed, but can't be done without agreement by the population.
That's a very mindful answer, thank you. And now on to Becky, sorry. As a leader of the Climate Citizens Group, can you explain your mission and how citizens can more effectively engage with climate policy?
Sure. Well, Jane teed me up perfectly, because what my research group here at Lancaster aims to do is to put democracy at front and centre of the way that we tackle climate change. And what I mean by that is not the sort of pastiche idea of democracy, which is that, once every 5 years you get to put a cross on a piece of paper and put it in a box. It's not about electoral competition. It's actually about a meaningful and sustained dialogue between the state and citizens. And that's what we look at in our research group through a lot of different lenses. So, we tackle the sort of the theory side of that, of course, because we're academics and we love that. But we also look at that in very practical ways. Jane's and Wales's architecture around future generations is a really good example of essentially a democratic innovation, how you involve future generations in decision making in the present. So that falls within the same umbrella in a way. There are also formal things like citizens' assemblies, and I helped to run Climate Assembly UK, which was one of the first national level climate assemblies, and then also down to the sort of very day-to-day of policy making. So we've worked with the Climate Change Committee that I now advise as well, to make sure that when they're producing their sort of their reports about UK carbon targets and how we achieve them, that they include evidence from people. So they've established a citizens panel which brings together a representative sample of people, and as well as crunching the numbers and looking at technology assessments, they now look at what kinds of policies would be engaging for people, and that people would that people would like to take forward, and that would improve their lives and communities. So we're finding all kinds of ways to try and build a stronger democracy that works for climate at a time when democracy has never been more challenged. So you can imagine what some of our chats are like, but I absolutely remain firm to that mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I think obviously we're in particularly divisive times at the moment, and kind of participation in democracy is really important. So that sort of brings me to you, Dio. In a lot of your academic work, you talk about kind of institutional barriers based on race to participation in democracy, particularly with racially minoritized people. So I wanted to ask, can you kind of explain these barriers and kind of talk about your research surrounding minoritized participation in democracy and why it's important?
I said this
2 minutes.
I said this to
Start
Finn
with the first
earlier. I've got the longest question. So I think what are the barriers? So I am going to speak from kind of the work that I do in terms of racial justice, but I want to sort of highlight that the work I do is intersectional. So while I might be speaking about race in particular, but racially minoritized people are also kind of, there's a class element, disability, and other kind of other structural identities. But I will just kind of start from race, but sort of it applies more broadly. I think in terms of the institutional barriers to participation, so not kind of electoral, I'm not sort of in that space of electoral participation, but just generally kind of participatory deliberative processes like some of the democratic innovations that Becky spoke about. So a lot of that is people aren't aware of these types of instances or opportunities to get involved. In the sense, and this is not a deficit kind of model of saying there's something wrong with the groups, it's just that they're not connected to kind of these spaces of power or power kind of to policymakers, and so they're not recruited into the spaces where sort of conversations are happening about issues in the areas. There's a lack of trust historically, where they've not experienced the state as a benevolent force in their lives, and so kind of when there are invitations to participate in these kind of spaces, there's a kind of, well, they won't listen to me anyways, or they won't believe kind of the stories that I want to share. And so in terms of how do we then challenge, so there's loads of other things I could talk about, but I'll just sort of give those two as a starting point. And in terms of challenging those, in terms of addressing those challenges, if you've heard me speak, there are three things I kind of bang on about, is to go to where people are, particularly, so rather than inviting them into spaces they don't necessarily kind of feel comfortable with, is go to where they are, so whether that's in community centres or, faith organisations, in short, go to where people are, and that way you're centering their experiences, you're making sure the substantive content of policy is representative or includes their views. It's a willingness to share power, which is why one of the things you said kind of resonated, because if there's a willingness from the policymakers to hear and respond to these kind of experiences, then it's more likely that they will trust so representatives of the state and kind of be more involved with that, and to think about the allocation of resources to support the substantive content that they put forward. I'll stop there. Have I answered all the questions?
Yes, there is a follow-up question.
Okay.
Just in case the first one wasn't long enough. So this is open to all three of you, but I'd like to hear your answer firstly. Why is this kind of participatory inclusion particularly essential for a sustainable future?
Yeah. So for me, I think it was really, I'm going to go read the report on risk that you talked about, that you've sort of said at the start of the slide, because I think for me, particularly for marginalised groups, they're always at a risk of disproportionately bearing the costs of kind of inequalities, whether that's kind of, and those who bear the brunt of kind of environmental inequalities are also kind of, they're more likely to be marginalised. And so it's really important that we think about how to include their voices as part of this, to make sure that their experiences are included, so that the benefits and costs, so I wrote that down, the benefits and costs are shared fairly. Because if not, what will happen if we're thinking about sustainability without kind of really engaging with the current inequalities, is that we will reproduce the inequalities in the future. And so we need to interrupt and kind of ensure that there's no reproduction of those inequalities by kind of centering their experiences. So I'll hand over to Becky.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to answer that question by telling you about a specific research finding from our group, and actually it's not me who wrote this, it's my colleagues Jake Ainscough and Pancho Lewis, but we worked with a group of representative citizens of the UK over 6 months to talk to them about how to tackle climate change. This was around the time of COP21 in Glasgow, and the pattern that emerged was really fascinating and gives you the answer to the question of why we need to engage people, because the more that people found out, so everyone comes in with a high level of climate concern, that's pretty universal. I mean, 60-70% of people are really worried. They come in, the more they find out about it, the more worried they get, and the more they realise that this, that they can act as individual consumers, but that ain't going to cut the mustard. That it's actually, needs some pretty strong societal and economic shifts, and that requires government. So, they then turn to government, but when they look at government, they don't really think that government's going to solve it. And why is that? It's because government hasn't told them it's going to do that, right? Because they don't think that people care. And so you have this silent standoff where people are saying, come on, government, step up to the plate, do this stuff. And government's saying, oh, no, we're not doing this because we don't think people would vote for it. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding between the two sides, which I think is a massive ingredient in the breakdown in political trust we're seeing at the moment, not just on climate, but on other issues. So anything you can do to bridge those gaps, like the kind of processes that you're talking about, Dea, or, whether that's very much at a sort of community level, whether that's informal, or whether that's very big, fancy, formal processes like Climate Assembly UK, that bridges that gap, builds a better democracy, gets you a better answer, builds the mandate for stronger policies, and then hopefully, this is still what I cling to, creates that kind of virtuous circle where both sides, the citizen and the state, feel like this is a joint endeavour.
That's great. Jane, do you have a...
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd want to add, and I think all our reports are quite short, apart from food, which is massive, because people haven't really engaged with the food agenda. So, we're kind of still in the infancy of that. But I think, I really like the fact that our education and skills report is really tied to opportunities for new kinds of jobs. And I think it's really interesting that today the CBI are saying that actually the biggest growth in the UK is going to come from those green jobs, and that therefore government should be embracing it, absolutely. And I do think that universities have a major obligation here, because that's where the brightest and the best go to learn, and schools do too. So we are talking in our work about making sure that all the way through the school system, through the college system, through the university system, people are brought up to date, and that staff and students are brought up to date on the most impactful way that they can behave, they can lobby, whatever. And I do think it's critical, because otherwise those people who have got the, sort of the potentially the best brains to solve this stuff are actually uninformed. Deliberately. It can only be deliberate. I mean, when the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries says, this is the biggest single challenge, that should be the biggest wake-up call of all.
So,
Waiting for the mic.
sorry. I think just responding to both of you about kind of how do we get people kind of thinking about it, coming up with kind of solutions and things like that. And I think I wanted to sort of bring this idea of community organising into the room, in the sense of, some of the brightest brains are in universities, but they're also outside of these institutions. And so making sure that we are kind of engaging with communities, in whether that's through kind of formal spaces or not, it's kind of organising people around this idea of actually we need to demand better and more from our government.
Demand better. Yeah. That's a very good way to focus on this.
To demand better, and hopefully then that can sort of we can see some response to that.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much. So I guess as a kind of concluding statement, I encourage everyone here tonight to go home and consider their role and think about how your mindset could be adapted for a sustainable future. So I want to hand over to Jane for our final words.
Can I just finish with this a whole idea about how we are at a moment in time. I mean, all of us are at a moment in time. My grandchild is 4, so she's in her first decade. My mum is 95, so she's in her 10th decade. And therefore, if you think about my grandchild's potential life, all things being equal, between them, they will span 200 years. That's your 7 generations. So we all live in our families with the oldest person we love and the youngest person we love. We live with those 7 generations in the people we love. So act. As though you loved them. Really. I think it's just that sort of the thing that kind of sustains me in a way and makes me feel I do need to do this stuff, because this is not just about others. This is about me and my family and people I love and people I really care about. And I want my grandchild's future to be as good as my mum, who used to love the fact that there hadn't been a war since the one she was in as a child, sort of thing. So let's think about how we can keep each other safe, and that is about demonstrating love for both generations.
And the hashtag FutureGen.
Hashtag FutureGen.
All right, thank you very much.